here is one of the bonus that they put in here, things to help us in our reading, and it's the historical books of the Old Testament we're getting into, from Joshua on down to Esther. We're going to be reading these historical books. The books of Joshua through Esther are traditionally known as the historical books of the Old Testament. This doesn't mean that other books of the Old Testament don't have historical value. Rather, the historical books are called that because the writer's main objective is to show God's hand in the history of the people of Israel. This is important to know. Notice, even though we had history in these last few books, we also had a lot of admonition. Deuteronomy was all about Moses preparing the people to go into the land, and had a lot to do with building up their faith, ready to go in to conquer the land. The purpose was not to outline the law of Moses as Leviticus and Deuteronomy do. It was not to express praise or lament in poetic form as psalms and lamentations do. It was not to record the words of the prophets as the words of Isaiah and Ezekiel do. Instead, the historical books tell stories. And that's sometimes the best way for us to learn is true stories. Naturally, these stories are told from a certain point of view, just as it's impossible to look at a flower or rock or tree or from more than one angle at a time. It is inevitable that a historical account will reflect the perspective of the person or group of people writing it. This perspective includes the writer's national or ethnic ties and their cultural norms. Knowing this can help us understand that the writers and compilers of the historical books focus on certain details while leaving out others. That is true today. Just look at how history is written. It is not a straight line. Even if you go back to 2020 and see how many different accounts there are of the same situation that all of us seem to have faced together. Yet, in history, it will point out to be different. And go 100 years from now and see what the history looks like for 2020. In fact, if you want, it's kind of interesting to go back 100 years from 2020 to when they had a similar plague hit a world plague of similar proportions, and what happened there. One of the things that came out of that was that we started using little plastic cups instead of sharing a cup passed around to everybody in the congregation for the sacrament. Interesting little details. Now, if that's the only detail you get from 100 years ago, well, it might be really interesting, and I think it is. But somebody else might have had a whole different idea of how it changed political situations. Now we're talking about something thousands of years ago, and of course they're going to have their own way of looking at things. Remember that when you're going through the Bible. Look at what they want us to understand and then understand it. So the compilers of the historical books focus on certain details while leaving out others. They made assumptions that would not have been made. They came to conclusions based on these details and assumptions. We can even see different perspectives across the books of the Bible, and sometimes within the same book. The more we are aware of these perspectives, the better we can understand the historical books. One perspective common to all the Old Testament and historical books is the perspective of children of Israel, God's covenant people. Their faith in the Lord helped them see His hand in their lives and in the affairs of the nations. So remember that, to look at that the Lord, faith in the Lord, helped them. And remember that we're looking for Christ in these things as well, and what the Lord does for the people in these situations, because they are the covenant people. That is what these stories are doing. Well, secular history books don't tend to see things this way. The spiritual perspective is part of what makes the Old Testament historical books so valuable to people who are seeking to build their own faith in God. Context for the rest of the Old Testament. The historical books begin where the book of Deuteronomy leaves off, with the Israelites' years of wandering in the wilderness about to end. The book of Joshua shows the children of Israel ready to enter Canaan, their promised land, and describes how they took it over. The books that follow, Judges through 2nd Chronicles, depicts Israel's experience in the promised land, from the time they settled it until the time they were conquered by Assyria and Babylon. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell of the return of several groups of Israelites to their capital, Jerusalem, decades later. Finally, the book of Esther relates the story of the Israelites living in exile under Persian rule. And that's where the chronology of the Old Testament ends. Some first-time Bible readers are surprised to find that they've actually finished reading the story of the Old Testament before they've read much more than half of its pages. After Esther, we don't get much information about the history of the Israelites. Instead, the books that follow, especially the books, fit within the timeline of the historical books presented. Now, I've kind of ignored these numbers that you look here. I've read them already, but if you look at the number here, number 3, we're already number 3. There's 3 different sections that it talks about, but it gives you a little more information than what I've been reading. Toward the beginning of this resource, you will find Old Testament overview, a timeline that shows how the ministry of each prophet fits into the history of Israel, as well as can be determined. You'll notice that most of the prophetic books of the Old Testament fall near the end of that timeline, just before and just after the children of Israel were conquered and exiled and scattered by their enemies. Why did they do that? Because one thing is that that's when they needed more prophetic guidance than ever before. And another thing is they're starting to see things that Moses said would happen come to pass, and what other prophets have said would happen. And I'm just going to flip there really quick just for the fun of it. So we've got in the Old Testament, we've got Adam and Eve, Enoch, Noah. As you see, it goes down and we see Exodus and Moses and Joshua. Then we go into the Judges. We've got Deborah, Gideon, Samson, Ruth, Hannah, Samuel. All of those are in the Judges. Then we've got the united monarchy, which is Saul, David, and Solomon. But after Solomon's time, they divide the kingdoms. We've got Judah on one side, or the Jews, and Israel on the other side. So they have the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. We have the kings Rehoboam, Uzziah, Hezekiah, Josiah. We've got Jeroboam the first, Ahab, Jeroboam the second, and Hosea. And then we just go through all these different things. As you see, the 10 tribes of Israel get conquered by Assyria and scattered. We got then more stuff about Zedekiah, Babylon. We've got Jerubbabel. We've got Esther. We've got all these other the prophets: Isaiah, Micah, Joel, Jeremiah, Obadiah. If you notice, by Joel, they have a question mark. Why? Because he wasn't written historically. He was written about things that were happening. And so there's a few things in there that are really interesting to look at closer. You can do that on your own time. I'm going to go back and look more. The ministry of the prophet Jeremiah, for example, took place during the events recorded in 2 Kings 22 to 25, and parallel account in Chronicles 34 through 36. Knowing this can influence the way you read both historical narratives and prophetic narratives. When something doesn't fit, when reading the Old Testament, as with any history, you're likely to read about people doing or saying things that, to modernize, seem strange or even troubling. We should expect this. The Old Testament writers saw the world from a perspective that was in some ways quite different from ours. Violence, ethnic relations, and roles of women are just some of the issues that ancient writers might have seen differently than we do today. So what should we do when we come across passages of Scripture that seem troubling? First, it might help to consider each passage in a broader context. How does it fit in God's plan of salvation? How does it fit what you know about the nature of Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ? How does it fit with revealed truths of other scriptures or the teachings of the living prophets? And how does it fit with the whisperings of the Spirit to your own heart and mind? These are things that we should be asking ourselves while we're reading these, and hopefully as I go through it, you'll get some of that. But also some of that is stuff that you can only do on your own. In some cases, the passages may not seem to fit well with any of these. Sometimes the passage may be like a puzzle piece that doesn't look like it has a place among the pieces you've already assembled. Trying to force a piece to fit isn't the best approach, but neither is giving up on the entire puzzle. Instead, you may need to set a piece aside for a time. As you learn more and put together more of the puzzle, you may be able to see better see how the pieces fit together. It can also help to remember that in addition to being limited to a particular perspective, scriptural histories are subject to human error. For example, over the centuries, many plain and precious things are taken away from the Bible, including the important truths about doctrines, ordinances, and covenants. At the same time, we should be willing to admit that our own perspectives are limited. There will always be things we don't fully understand and the questions we can't answer. Finding the gems, but in the meantime, unanswered questions shouldn't keep us from precious gems of eternal truth that are found in the Old Testament, even if these gems are sometimes hidden in the rocky ground of troubling experiences and poor choices made by imperfect people. Perhaps the most precious of all these gems is the stories and passages that testify of God's love, especially those that point our minds toward the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Viewed from any angle, gems like these shine just as brightly today as they did back then. And because these accounts tell of the account of the people of God, men and women who had human weaknesses and yet loved and served the Lord, gems of truth abound in the historical books of the Old Testament. That is where we're going here, and look for the gems as we read it the next while, and we'll see you in the next time.